Chapter 6 of Captains Courageous. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Captains Courageous by Rudyard Kipling. Chapter 6. The thing that struck him most was the exceedingly casual way in which some craft loafed about in the broad Atlantic. Fishing boats, as Dan said, were naturally dependent on the courtesy and wisdom of their neighbors, but one expected better things of steamers. That was after another interesting interview, when they had been chased for 3 miles by a big lumbering old cattle boat, all boarded over on the upper deck, that smelt like 1,000 cattle pens. A very excited officer yelled at them through a speaking trumpet, and she lay and lolloped helplessly on the water while Disko ran the We're Here under her lee and gave the skipper a piece of his mind.
"Where might ye be, eh? Ye don't deserve to be anywheres. You barnyard tramps go hoggin' the road on the high seas with no blame consideration for your neighbors, and your eyes in your coffee cups instead of your silly heads." At this the skipper danced on the bridge, and said something about Disko's own eyes.
"We haven't had an observation for 3 days. Do you suppose we can run her blind?" he shouted.
"Well, I can," Disko retorted. "What's come to your lead? Et it? Can't you smell bottom, or are them cattle too rank?"
"What do you feed 'em?"
asked Uncle Salters with intense seriousness, for the smell of the pens woke all the farmer in him.
"They say they fall off dreadful on a voyage. Dunno as it's any o' my business, but I've a kind o' notion that oil cake broke small an' sprinkled—" "Thunder!" said a cattleman in a red jersey as he looked over the side. "What asylum did they let his whiskers out of?" "Young feller," Salters began, standing up in the fore rigging, "let me tell you 'fore we go any further that I've—" The officer on the bridge took off his cap with immense politeness. "Excuse me," he said, "but I've asked for my reckoning. If the agricultural person with the hair will kindly shut his head, the sea-green barnacle with the wall-eye may perhaps condescend to enlighten us."
"Now you've made a show of me, Salters," said Disko angrily.
He could not stand up to that particular sort of talk, and snapped out the latitude and longitude without more lectures.
"Well, that's a boatload of lunatics, sure,"
said the skipper as he rang up the engine room and tossed a bundle of newspapers into the schooner.
"Of all the blamed fools, next to you, Salters, him and his crowd are about the likeliest I've ever seen," said Disko as the We're Here slid away. "I was just giving him my judgment on lulysickin' round these waters like a lost child, and you must cut in with your fool farmin'. Can't you never keep things separate?"
Harvey, Dan, and the others stood back, winking one to the other in full of joy, but Disko and Salters wrangled seriously till evening, Salters arguing that a cattle boat was practically a barn on blue water, and Disko insisting that, even if this were the case, decency and fisher pride demanded that he should have kept things separate. Long Jack stood in silence for a time. An angry skipper makes an unhappy crew, and then he spoke across the table after supper.
"For what's the good o' bodderin' what they'll say?" said he.
"They'll tell that tale agin us for years, that's all," said Disko. "Oil cake sprinkled."
"With salt, of course," said
Salters, impenitent, reading the farming reports from a week-old New York paper.
"It's plumb mortifyin' to all my feelin's," the skipper went on.
"Can't see it that way,"
said Long Jack, the peacemaker.
"Look at here, Disko. Is there another packet afloat this day in this weather could have met a tramp and over above given her her reckoning? Over and above that, I say, could have discoursed with her quite intelligent on the management of steers and such at sea? Forget it. Of course they will not. 'Twas the most compendious conversation that I've ever accrued. Double game and twice running, all to us."
Dan kicked Harvey under the table, and Harvey choked in his cup.
"Well,"
said Salters, who felt that his honour had been somewhat plastered,
I said I didn't know 'twas any business of mine 'fore I spoke." "And right there," said Tom Platt, experienced in discipline and etiquette, "right there, I take it, Disko, you should ha' asked him to stop if the conversation was likely, in your judgment, to be anyways what it shouldn't."
"Dunno but that's so,"
said Disko, who saw his way to an honourable retreat from a fit of the dignities.
"Why, of course 'twas so," said Salters. "You bein' skipper here, an' I'd cheerful have stopped on a hint, not from any leadin' or conviction, but for the sake of bearin' an example to these two blame boys of ours."
"Didn't I tell you, Harve, 'twould come around to us 'fore we'd done? Always those blame boys! But I wouldn't have missed the show for a half share in a halibutter," Dan whispered.
"Still, things should have been kep' sep'rate,"
said Disko, and the light of new argument lit in Salters's eye as he crumbled cut plug into his pipe.
"There's a power of vartue in keepin' things sep'rate," said Long Jack, intent on stilling the storm. "That's what Steyning, of Steyning and Hare's, fund when he sent Counahan fer skipper on the Manila Ticoon, instead of Captain Newton that was took with inflammatory rheumatism and couldn't go. Counahan the Navigator, we called him."
Nick Counahan he never went aboard for a night 'thout a pond of rum somewheres in the manifest, said Tom Platt, playing up to the lead. "He used to burn round the commission houses to Boston lookin' for the Lord to make him captain of a towboat on his merits. Sam Coy, up to Atlantic Avenue, gave him his board free for a year or more on account of his stories. Counahan the Navigator. Dead these 15 year, ain't he?" "17, I guess. He died the year the Caspar McVeagh was spilt, but he could never keep things sep'rate. Steyning took him fer the reason the thief took the hot stove, because there was nothin' else that season. The men was all to the Banks, an' Counahan he whacked up an everlastin' hard crowd fer crew. Rum! Ye could ha' floated the Manila, insurance an' all, in fwhat they stowed aboard her. They left Boston Harbor for the Great Grand Bank with a roarin' northwester behind 'em, an' all hands full to the bung. An' the hivens looked after 'em, for divil a watch did they set, an' divil a rope did they lay hand to, till they'd seen the bottom of a 15-gallon cask o' bug juice. That was about 1 week, so far as Counahan remembered. If I could only tell the tale as he told it. All that while the wind blew like old glory, an' the Manila, 'twas summer, an' they give her a foretopmast, struck her gait an' kep' it. Then Counahan took the hog yoke, an' thrembled over it for a while, an' made out, betwixt that an' the chart, an' the singin' in his head, that they was to the south'ard o' Sable Island, gettin' along glorious, but speakin' nothin'. Then they broached another keg, an' quit speculatin' about anything fer another spell. The Manila she lay down when she dropped Boston Light, an' she never luffed her lee rail up to that time. Hustlin' on 'em one o' the same slant, but they saw no weed, nor gulls, nor schooners, an' prisintly they obsarved they'd been out a matter o' 14 days, an' they mistrusted the Bank had suspended payment. So they sounded, an' got 60 fathom. 'That's me,' says Counahan. 'That's me ivry time. I've run her slat on the Bank fer ye, an' when we get 30 fathom we'll turn in like little men. Counahan is the boy,' says he. 'Counahan the Navigator.' Next cast they got 90. Says Counahan, 'Either the lead line's took to stretchin' or else the Bank's sunk.' They hauled it up, bein' just about in that state when it seemed right an' reasonable, an' set down on the deck countin' the knots, an' gettin' her snarled up hejus. The Manila she'd struck her gait, an' she held it, an' presently along come a tramp, an' Counahan spoke her. 'Have ye seen any fishin' boats now?' says he, quite casual. 'There's lashin's of 'em off the Irish coast,' says the tramp. 'Ah! Go shake yourself,' says Counahan. 'Fwhat have I to do with the Irish coast?' 'For what are ye doin' here?' says the tramp. 'Sufferin' Christianity,' says Counahan. He always said that when his pump sucked an' he was not feelin' good. 'Sufferin' Christianity,' he says. 'Where am I at?' 35 mile west sou'west of Cape Clear,' says the tramp, 'if that's any consolation to ye.' Counahan fetched one jump, 4 feet 7 inches measured by the cook. 'Consolation!' says